Related to that, I'm a point person for monitoring discussions at the city. So I've been with the city about 5 years. And actually before that, I was working for monitoring consultants in Fort Collins, air resource specialists. So I used to work with the Park Service, the Forest Service, and others on some pretty large monitoring projects. So a lot of background in monitoring. And I'm also a graduate of CSU Atmospheric Science. And I've met many of you before, but probably not everybody.
No, it's the first time I've met you, and that's an impressive background. So have you, sounds like you always worked in Colorado then?
Oh yeah, born in Fort Collins.
Oh, great, yeah. Well, we'll go quickly around the list here. I'm Rick Casey. I've been with the Larimer Alliance since it started in summer of 2018, I believe. And the other people on the call are also members of the steering committee for the Larimer Alliance. I'm the webmaster for the website, and I also teach a course in environmental economics at Front Range. So Vicki, why don't you go next? Need to unmute.
Cassie, I'll skip introducing myself to her. I've worked with Cassie for a number of years. Thanks.
Yes, good to see you, Vicki.
Hi, Cassie.
Well,
muted.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Gayla, can you go next?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Cassie. We've also met on previous occasions, most recently in the meeting that Vicki and you and I had with Kelly Smith. I just realized you and I do have something in common, though, in that I also was born in Fort Collins.
Oh, neat. So, Poudre Valley Hospital?
Yes. Even my mother was born in Poudre Valley.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
You have deeper roots than I do.
Well, great. Doug, why don't you speak up next?
Well, I'll just say good morning, Cassie. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Doug, good to see you.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming to Air Quality Board a couple weeks ago, too.
Yeah. And Ed, our treasurer, our secretary.
Hi. I've been in Fort Collins about 5 years, but we were drawn to retire here because we had heard of the efforts Fort Collins was trying to make environmentally. So, you know, glad to meet you and work with y'all.
Great. So, Cassie, I assume you got my email with some of the questions we wanted to address this morning.
I also see a Ticey on the line. Sorry to interrupt, but there was one that I didn't.
Yeah, that was actually Tom Rhodes. He was the host, but he had to leave.
Oh, okay. Never mind then. Sorry to interrupt.
TC is actually his wife's name. I don't know why his name's not up there, but yeah, Tom Rhodes is our, he's on our board as well, and he's our treasurer, but he's a busy man with lots of other volunteer activities that he does.
Oh, sure.
So I assume you got our my email that was sort of a collection of questions from us. Would you like to maybe start just by addressing them?
I'm realizing I might have missed your email.
Well, I can ask you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, let me. I got the one with the invite.
Rick, I wonder if you could post it in the chat.
Yeah, I could do that.
Or maybe a question at a time. It might be too much in the chat altogether.
Oh, I see it now too. Like it was below the Zoom invite. Yeah, I apologize. I missed that.
I could put it in the chat. And that way we could document what we're doing.
Sure.
So I just posted 4 questions there. Hope you can see them.
Not yet in the chat, but I still have them in my email. And I know you're recording. I could even say them out loud before we go through them.
Yeah. So
Okay, so the first one I see is how can Fort Collins get 2 air quality monitoring stations using Boulder air technology like Longmont Boulder and Broomfield have done? Which is more important for regional monitoring? So this is, so I'm familiar with some of this large scale monitoring that Dr. Helvig has done, and Broomfield, I know CSU has been engaged in some of that monitoring. I'll add that So Fort Collins last year, earlier in the year, we collaborated with CSU also, like we were looking at EPA grant opportunities to get more monitoring like that out. So we put together a grant probably to the tune of about $500,000 to get some really similar type monitoring. The bonus of those types, like there's I mean, you guys are probably familiar with like the scales of monitoring. You can go really low cost and get something like particle monitors. You can go really full scale, like some of these really advanced ones that have like suites of volatile organic compounds, oil and gas tracers, other attribution tracers. Like you can start to say what's from vehicles versus other sources if you have good source profiles. So, and I know the Longmont information, they're now collaborating with CSU because you can have a bunch of data, but then you pick it apart with source profiles. CSU has some really good source profiles, so they're collaborating on something like that. So how would Fort Collins get those? That is one avenue we're pursuing, is how can we do that through research grade type things like with CSU? And we're going to keep our eyes open for more of those. Other options, some things that aren't as available to us. I'll say that Longmont and Broomfield, so that they have more resources for this than we do. Like they have, like if we're talking about an oil and gas conversation, we don't have a lot of resources there and we don't have a lot of development. So it's harder to pull in those same kind of resources that they are. So that's a really difficult city council budget conversation. $500,000 for a study like that has to come out of something else for our city council. So just to keep a balanced budget.
Right.
We did put in an offer, I think about 4 years ago in the offer cycle. So there was a request, but it wasn't funded either. So I know going through city council that has not been successful. We think we can be successful with a grant opportunity, but we also think regionally, like there's a lot of what these monitoring sites are doing that's relevant here too. So there's the question of like, what are the gaps and what it would add? And there's so much rich information being collected right now that if we're going to leverage some of that, like it still behooves us to kind of see what's locally relevant out of that too, so that we can really focus on gaps and opportunities.
Fine. Actually, the fourth question did regard financing. You mentioned how these other communities get funding from oil and gas sources, and Vicki identified some severance tax money. Has that ever been part of your discussions with the city?
So we brought that to our budgeting folks, trying to kind of trace where it went. So this was kind of news to me when we're finding out. So where does that money go? So it goes into our general fund, and it has, like, it's not related to the amount of oil and gas development within the city. It's allocated to us whether or not we have development. So we get, I think it varies, like to the tune of about 200,000 per year to up to 400,000 per year. It is not specifically slated for anything. It goes into our general fund. So the city has a budget. It's dropped in the budget, and then things get allocated through our budgeting for objective cycle. Sorry. And that's coming up too. Like there's going to be a whole public comment period around this budgeting for objective cycle. But like what I've found out anyways, is that's not how that money works. It doesn't come in and then get allocated specifically for something. Not to say it couldn't. I mean, that could be an argument, but when we've tried to have that conversation, you're still taking something away from somewhere to put it somewhere else in the city's balanced budget, if that makes sense.
I was interested when I was looking this morning at the city plan that's up on your website. Several of the policies that you have stated there would support using some of that money for a monitoring station, like 4.3 regional pollution work with local and regional partners to identify and mitigate sources of transported pollutants that influence our local air quality. And without reading them all, there were several on that page 9, I think it was, that seemed to relate directly to what this monitoring would be purposed for. So hopefully that would give some good justification for allocating some of those funds to this kind of a modern monitoring system.
Doug?
I suggest that we don't go straight into the weeds of budgets because that gets, it might focus us down too much in a sense. And we need to, I mean, if we're convinced of what needs to happen, then we can engage in advocacy to try to get budgets to back up what needs to happen. So I would suggest we really focus. As I see the air quality problems, I mean, Cassie, you said, well, the oil and gas isn't a priority in the budget discussions or the city council because it's not in Fort Collins. Well, we're breathing some of the worst air quality in North America because largely of the oil and gas industry. So while that is not immediately within city boundaries, every single breathing human being in the city is breathing bad air quality because of oil and gas. So this argument that people like Troxel and Summers put forward, oh, it's not our problem. Well, it's not your problem as long as you don't breathe. But if you breathe, you're breathing that stuff that's coming out of 30,000 wells in Weld County and the rest of the Front Range. And it's true, it's not entirely that, but the NCAR Frappe study conclusively identified oil and gas as the main contributor to our air quality problems in northern Colorado. So it is oil and gas, and it is something that's of immediate concern to every resident, every taxpayer in the city, because they're breathing terrible air because of the oil and gas industry. Detlev Helmig has developed a methodology which identifies signature pollutants from a distance and can tie our air quality problems to the sources, which in where he's got sites elsewhere, he can correlate closely to oil and gas emissions. The CSU methodology cannot do that. The oil and gas industry loves the CSU methodology because it will never produce evidence that ties air quality problems to oil and gas. If we want to address our regional air quality problems, we need a methodology that can do it. There is a methodology out there. Everybody in Fort Collins is suffering because of this problem. So we need to distinguish between regional air quality and localized air quality problems. The CSU methodology is very appropriate for very localized methodology problems. Put canisters on the perimeters of immediate oil and gas sites and identify when there are leaks and things. That's fine. And that's probably appropriate for example, the Prospect Energy sites in Northeast Fort Collins. And those sites should have immediate site monitoring to identify problems, which doesn't exist now. But that's different and completely needs to be separated from the regional air quality problems. And that's why we need to be advocating for a methodology which exists now. And yes, it costs, but let's fight the battle about budget once we get onto the political radar screen. The need to get regional air quality monitoring in place so that we can address the problems. Anyway, okay, so I'll stop at that point. But that's kind of the way I frame it, and then we'll solve the budget problem down the road. But let's first be clear about what the problem is and what the possibilities are to address it.
Oh, sure. Well, and just to add, like, I don't disagree with any of that. The ozone problems, like, there's really clear attribution information showing that oil and gas and vehicles are our biggest contributor to our ozone issues here in Fort Collins. So we are a part of a non-attainment area. And that's clear, I would say, also to the Regional Air Quality Council. So as you guys talk about these avenues, there are a few. So I know that was your original intent, Rick, when you reached out, like, okay, how do we have this conversation? What's a productive way to have this conversation? Certainly with our budget cycle coming up, I mean, we can table that discussion, but a clear case of the why, as Doug was saying, and there is a good why more information would be valuable. I mean, the things that, like, I would look for in a why too is, like, what does it add? The things that we know oil and gas is contributing to our ozone problems. We know transportation is contributing. We know that there's regional, and we know we have an ozone problem, and we know it's not going away anytime soon. Like, ozone is a really challenging problem. And part of that NCAR work that you cited, like they looked at some modeling studies, which was really interesting. They would zero out, like they play the what if scenario, which you can do in modeling. Can't do in real life, unfortunately, but the what if we zeroed out transportation, and what if we zeroed out oil and gas, and they could see what impact it would make on ozone. Because it's a combo thing, even zeroing either of those out, we're still like just on the edge of an ozone issue. Like zeroing out oil and gas made the biggest difference, like 4 or 5 ppb in modeling. So yeah, all the caveats of modeling aside and all the assumptions. So I'd say if you were making your argument, the way I might approach it is like, here's our knowns, here's what we know is already happening. More needs to happen. Like, is it a question about there needs to be more local advocacy for more controls? If that's the angle, it's like, then what information is missing to make that case? Would more monitoring information help? I mean, I'll say like I mentioned that we were working on the grant opportunities with CSU, and we're definitely interested in what Longmont and Broomfield are gathering. Like there's a lot more to be known about oil and gas, because oil and gas isn't just an ozone contributor either. Like you guys have touched on, it's a mix of things. Like there are hundreds of thousands of volatiles in that mix. And you can talk about it in terms of ozone, hazardous, air pollutants, but you can also talk about haze particles, like there are secondary pollutants. And so there's more planning going on. I don't know if you guys track the regional haze rule and the planning going on around that, but it intersects quite a bit. Actually, there are 3 regulatory processes that are all intersecting. There's greenhouse gas emissions, there's ozone attainment, and there's regional haze. All of them are taking a really close look at oil and gas and identifying oil and gas sources as a part of our problem. Regional haze is going to look at the impact at national parks, so Rocky Mountain National Park. Greenhouse gas is going to look at the methane emissions, and you're not going to see methane in any hazardous pollutants or ozone precursor conversation. So as far as the why, like there are a lot of intersecting conversations coming together.
Yeah, Cassie, to that point, I was very curious that, so say we do identify all the sources of these pollutants, then what? I mean, what does the law allow the city or the county to do about it? I mean, can we really tell Weld County to stop what they're doing? I really haven't seen that question answered.
So ozone attainment is a state responsibility prescribed by the EPA. So that's why the state's going to have organizations like the RAC, the Regional Air Quality Council. They're making a state ozone implementation plan. This is one of our best avenues. Like we actually have a CSU professor on the board of the RAC who's adding to that conversation. And he's actually the one who led that Northern Front Range study and was involved in the FRAPE stuff. So that's an avenue too. Like if you want to talk about what regional controls are happening, like they're the ones who are getting it in writing, and the city certainly tracks that in a regulatory way and will take party status to things like ozone non-attainment and push for more controls, not just on oil and gas industry, vehicles, all of those things. Mm-hmm. But oil and gas being one of our big levers for ozone.
Go ahead, Kayla.
Cassie, when you ask the question, what does it add? Actually, I have a question wrapped up in this, and that is when I was looking at the city air quality plan, there's a table at the end, table A3, the Larimer County emissions summary. Yeah. And I noticed it was curious to me that in that set of data, there's oil and gas, the numbers there showed that it contributed very, very little. So I'm wondering if this is an area where we could say this is where we need to add, because we're not measuring BTEX, you know, I'm forgetting them, but it includes the methane and the someone help me out here.
Benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes are the BTEX. So those are some of the most common hazardous.
Also the ethane that is used to then discriminate between what's being added by transportation, vehicle transportation versus oil and gas. If maybe those are some places where we can see from the data that's already been collected that we do have some gaps that could be filled in.
Sure. Well, and to your first question, like actually to Doug's point too, like that difference between what's a localized source, what's a regional source, that table you're looking at in the back of that plan, that showed what are the emissions in Larimer County, not what's coming in and impacting Larimer County. So also in that same appendix, there's an attribution pie chart, I know, for ozone. And that's the reason that I added actually that attribution pie chart, is because that didn't, just looking at our emissions from the county does not paint a full picture. As Doug said, there's a regional and a local conversation. So regionally, ozone's a regional conversation. That's why we have regional planners too. Regionally, you have to look at bigger picture.
And I just wanted to mention that we had a person join our meeting a little late, Lori Brunswick, if you'd like to say hi to everybody.
Hello. Thanks for inviting me to this.
Okay.
John, Rick,
Yeah.
Cassie mentioned there's a CSU professor on the board of the Regional Air Quality Council, but we have a direct representative from what's called the North Front Range Metropolitan Planning Organization. It used to be Jerry Hornack. I think it's Kristen Stevens now. Do you know Cassie?
Kristen Stevens now one of the county commissioners, so she's not, but I think she's still engaged in the MPO, because I
do too. And that's who we need to converse with, is the elected official from our area who's on that board also. And so Kristen is one we need to talk to.
They're a good avenue. I'll say that they're not going to be as focused on oil and gas sources as they are on transportation sources.
Right.
So they're digging really deep into the transportation. So the new ozone implementation plan requirements are going to come with transportation requirements, and they call it transportation conformity. And now they have to make sure that collectively as a region, transportation is going to start dropping in emissions and contribute less to our air pollution issues.
Well, any other questions at this time? Lori, did you want to ask any questions that you had?
No, I missed the first maybe 10 minutes of this, so I don't know what all you've already covered. I guess, I just wanted to bring up the, I forgot his first name, but Helmig, his testing that he does is incredible and scary. And if that doesn't wake people up, I don't know what would.
We did talk about that in the first 10 minutes, and Cassie is trying to get funding for such a station here in Larimer County.
Yes.
And Ed, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, with that in mind, given, as Doug points out, that it's a regional issue, the idea of collaboration between the different city governments and or the county government, comes to mind. And has any kind of discussions taken place like that? How we might approach that? That would be a question.
And you have new commissioners. I know that they're already having conversations about refreshing their oil and gas regulations. So that's a lever they can pull, but it's still only Larimer County. That's not talking about what's transported from east. But there are conversations about oil and gas monitoring. So when we talk about this, like what makes sense near a source versus what makes sense as regionally representative, there's an opportunity for local, like municipalities and counties to have some requirements related to oil and gas monitoring. And the state has some new requirements too, but that's very localized about these pre-production activities.
Yeah, that was another question I wanted to address, Cassie. I know you can't be on top of everything, but is there discussion at the state level for, having the state conducting regional air quality monitoring? Because that would seem to be really the logical level of government that should be administering this.
Yeah, I mean, agreed. The state and then the research grade stuff like CU and CSU, absolutely are important parts of the conversation. At the state level, they've committed to doing more regional monitoring. I know that they put out a monitoring plan, and we have conversations with them about what we can have in Fort Collins. I'll say one thing that we consistently put in there is we want more ozone monitoring. I mean, if we're talking here about VOCs, but better characterization of our ozone. We want to know more about what gets transported in as far as ozone. And we have a downtown ozone site that we think, ozone's a weird thing. Like if you have fresh vehicle sources, it can actually deplete ozone. So we have a downtown site that we think underrepresents our ozone. And then we have a foothills site where ozone rebuilds up. So we are having conversations with the state about that. The state is also responding to some industry pushback, I'll say. So when you talk about these big front range studies that characterize oil and gas emissions, you're going to have operators coming back to that conversation with, hey, we've gotten better since then. You're painting a worst case scenario. But like in that, they were still identifying individual wells. All wells have leaks. Like you guys know that because I know you guys have been in the advocacy realm for this. So there is this push to get more real-time data that isn't outdated, if you would call it outdated.
I would say we should embrace, when they say that they're doing better, I think we should embrace that and say, we agree that probably you're doing better. Let's put monitoring at your sites and quantify how better you're doing. I mean, it's an easy kind of hype, it's an easy point for them to say, but there's no quantification of it because there isn't on-site monitoring to really prove that it's the case. But it's a chance, if they come back with that kind of thing, it's a chance for us to say, yeah, let's hold hands and figure out how to quantify it. I have a couple of questions. I don't know if we can go in another direction. With the sites in Northeast Fort Collins, the Prospect Energy sites, several years ago, 350 Northern Colorado had a meeting talking about, it was around the time of the Firestone explosion. So part of the meeting, a lot of the meeting was focused like pipelines, do they pose a real danger to neighborhoods? And people, about 40, 50 people came to that meeting. And afterwards, an older man, I remember, unfortunately I've lost his name, but he came up and he told me that he had neighbors who had headaches that they attributed to Prospect Energy sites, immediate proximity to Prospect Energy sites. And I think he said they had filed complaints, but sort of never gotten anywhere with it. Does the city have a record of complaints, and is that public information?
So we have an oil and gas site. I don't even remember the last specific oil and gas related complaint that we got, but we do direct them. So if you, it depends on how you approach it. We certainly take general air quality complaints and people identify a source. If they go to our oil and gas site, what they're going to see front and center is the state's complaint line and go in there. And what we've done periodically is reach out to the state and ask them, hey, what are the complaints? Are there any in Larimer County? The last one I remember has actually been about 4 years, and there was a spill at the time. So it was really important to get that complaint. There was an odor, somebody reported it, and a spill was discovered. And that makes a case for some kind of continuous monitoring, so it doesn't have to be somebody's nose that discovers it. So that's a conversation that we're having about okay, what new regulations do we want on existing wells? As far as the people in the neighborhood too, so you guys probably know that the city right now is working on our oil and gas regulations. Council, they've given us work session feedback. So it's not a decision yet, but work session feedback that if new oil and gas were to come, it would be restricted to industrial zones and have at least a 2,000 foot setback. What that does effectively is mean that within city limits, no new potential for new oil and gas wells. So it turns our conversation to existing wells, and we want to have more conversation with those neighbors. So Doug or anybody, if you guys know of some people in that area, what we've tried to do is have some open houses, and we sent direct mailings to everybody within, I think, 1,000 foot of an oil and gas well at the time. And we try to identify them at our open houses and have really specific conversations. And we heard really mixed things. We heard some people oh, they're great neighbors and it preserves some green space for us. So we like that. And then others would say, well, sometimes I think there's an odor. Sometimes I don't really know, but I know we also have this pond over here and I don't know what's what. So So we're trying to bring them out so that we know what issues to address locally, which are so different than the big regional ozone issues.
Okay, Gayla?
Yes, Cassie, I have another question about the discussions that you say have been ongoing at the regional level. Is there any discussion of placing monitoring equipment on the southeast end of town, since most of our other monitoring is either downtown or to the west?
So in the CSU grant proposal, it was not funded, unfortunately. Like that was one of our proposed locations for a large scale VOC monitoring station. And we had 3 in the proposal, and about $500,000 was the request from EPA. We got really close. We had a debrief. We were in their top tier. So we want to keep trying.
The city's website says, on the oil and gas website says, the city of Fort Collins is seeking public input on approaches to how the city could regulate oil and gas development. And then it mentions a date of, I think, April 2020.
Yeah.
20. Anyway, I don't have it in front of me, but I'm curious: is the city still, in a sense, publicly receiving input, and what are the mechanisms for doing that? Are there sort of specific? I mean, we're having it now, obviously, with a conversation with you, but I'm thinking, are there sort of open portals right now for people and organizations to engage with the city in this process?
We need to refresh that, actually. So there's that. I don't know if you're on the Open City site or the FC.gov site. The Open City site is, that sucker is hard to maintain because we can't be very hands-on with it. So we have a whole I'll say that there have been challenges in maintaining that one and keeping it updated. So I think, we had a conversation last week about this. We're going to keep all the comments we've collected there and get a mechanism to get comments on the FC.gov site. And those would go directly to me and directly to Kelly Smith, who is my co-lead on looking at oil and gas regulations. So talking to either one of us is a great way to get these issues out. If you want to communicate directly with council, I know some of you have emailed our city leaders account. Coming to the Air Quality Advisory Board, they're having this discussion as well. And Doug, you were there last time. That's a good way to get it in front of them and hear the concerns. And this is their role, is everybody's role is to advise council, really, but they're a very targeted air quality group advising city council. And you guys mentioned the commissioners too, so some avenues through there to talk regionally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how closely does the city work with the county? And does the county have any air quality staff at all?
They have a couple, but they may be ramping up. They've got some renewed interest in air quality, as you can imagine, with some turnover. So there are a couple, so Tom Gonzalez is a lead over there. Somebody I work with a lot is Leah Schneider. And then they have land use planning folks that are working on oil and gas regulations, but their air quality group, this is Leah Schneider, and then they have somebody named Myrna. Their usual role, or their role to date, is they're contracted by the state to enforce compliance type things. So if there is, there are state odor standards, there are state air permits, there are regional inspectors. So if there's a complaint, Avago, I know you guys have been engaged in the Avago Broadcom conversation too. They get involved in checking permit compliance for that. So that's been their specific role. Regional monitoring, they're getting more push from their community to talk more about regional monitoring. So more than just Fort Collins. So a lot of the advocacy often comes from Fort Collins, but it's becoming bigger in Larimer County, and actually makes sense to do more. I would say within city limits, you're going to be pretty impacted by our urban emissions. So if you want to really fully characterize transport, getting these upwind things downwind of maybe your oil and gas field, upwind of Fort Collins is a great characterization point. And that would certainly involve the county.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ed?
You had mentioned that some of the studies were looking at the impact on I'm assuming the lakes primarily up in Rocky Mountain National Park. I'm wondering, as we approach this as a regional thing, do you think there would be interest in collaborating with Estes Park? You know, because their economy relies very heavily on people coming and going in the park. And if the park starts deteriorating because of all this, I would think that would be an issue we could bring them on board with.
So the lakes wasn't specifically what I was, so there is a nitrogen deposition issue for any water body. And there is some research actually that I know of that CSU is involved in about nitrogen deposition in lakes. The regulatory conversation happening right now is about regional haze. So that's more about like, you know, what has turned into particles, fine particles specifically, and created kind of a haze. And there's, in the Clean Air Act, there are regional haze rules that specify we have to get to natural conditions. It's kind of like our climate goals, actually. You have to get to natural conditions by 2064. And states have to do these periodic plans to demonstrate that. And part of that planning is this huge photochemical PM modeling effort, similar to what happens for ozone. So would Estes Park particularly be involved in that? Like, I haven't seen Estes Park very engaged, but certainly the Park Service, like the National Park Service, is engaged in that conversation for all the national parks. And then Colorado has a responsibility to track that for our national parks.
So are there people in Rocky Mountain Park, technicians that go out and service these sensors? I've seen some of those sensors sitting around the park out there in the woods, you know.
Oh yeah, they have really, so they're not gas. So oil and gas, you're talking about like VOC monitoring in a gas mix. For regional haze, there are particle monitors that actually speciate. So here in Fort Collins, we just measure particle. We don't know what's in it. We just have this amount, this weight of particles. Like if you guys have seen the measurements. In Rocky Mountain National Park, they have a monitor that will put it on several different filters, and it goes to a lab to be analyzed to see what's in it. And you can tell how much of it's nitrates, sulfates, organics. You can get all this, they call it speciated, get the parts. And then the modeling helps you back up from that and see where it came from. Mm-hmm. And yeah, regional haze focus for a long time was electrical generating units. They're shifting focus right now because they've kind of hit their low-hanging fruit there. So now, you know, as they keep trimming emissions, oil and gas is becoming a more prominent piece of the pie for them. So the regional haze rule is requiring looking more at, I'd say, organic and nitrate emissions from oil and gas wells are the things that contribute to regional haze.
Interesting. Yeah, Lori? Nita.
Yeah. I'm wondering about are there wells in the city limits that have not been properly closed off so that they potentially could be leaking methane or whatever, those types of compounds that are, and they're just out there, possibly in the, I guess the Sarah, is it Monterey? Sarah, I know Doug, you were telling me about that area that people were having problems. And I looked out there and it appears that there are a couple wells right out there that are shut in. And I don't know whether that won't allow any emissions from it, but is there anything we can do in that respect?
There is, I mean, it's not an actual yes, no answer that I can give you, but what I can say is the wells in Fort Collins that are active, and even the plugged and abandoned wells, like those all predated kind of this hydraulic fracturing gas production boom. So these were tapped into oil reservoirs, and there's always associated gas with oil. So you can imagine any oil has some associated gas with it. So they were tapped into oil reservoirs. Some of them built, like these ones that are plugged and abandoned that we're dealing with now, were maybe like 80 years old or something like that. So I will say, yes, there are some that are improperly plugged and abandoned. The way we are finding those, I don't know if you guys, I know we talked to some of you guys when we did some updates to reciprocal setbacks in 2018. One of those requirements was that there had to be, you had to locate the well. So there's an issue. Old wells, they're not mapped very well. Like, so you think you know where it is on the map that the state provides, you got to go set eyes on it to make sure it's there. So they have to be located. That's one of our requirements. The soil has to be sampled around it, and it has to be tested to make sure it's properly plugged and abandoned before any development can happen near it. And that's like, you know, when we're talking about some of these open areas still in that space. There are some other plugged and abandoned wells that are quite old, but I'll say, like, if we're thinking about Firestone risk, like that was a cut pipeline between wells. So it wasn't an old plugged and abandoned well. And to my knowledge, there's no information about methane issues at these older oil reservoir legacy wells.
Okay.
But there certainly is information saying that they're not plugged and abandoned according to today's standards.
So, well,
There's a
any-
group.
Have any more questions, Doug?
Well, there's a group called Earthworks that you may be acquainted with, Cassie, and they go out with a FLIR camera that's calibrated to catch, to be able to video emissions that are from oil and gas. You would understand the chemistry and all of that a lot. I don't, you know, I know nothing about the techniques or technology of that. Would the city be interested to work collaboratively with Earthworks? Because I mean, having those cameras cost $100,000, and then there has to be a certified operator. So actually doing the FLIR imagery is not a small budget item for any organization or local government to do. Earthworks it has a camera available. Sometimes it's going to get another camera that's specifically dedicated to the Front Range. It's going to have a certified operator. Would the city be interested to work kind of collaboratively with Earthworks to go out and, for example, just check some of the old well sites to see, are there emissions coming out? Because without the monitoring, we can only guess, but the monitoring is expensive. So here's Earthworks that's making an investment, and the city could work collaboratively with them. And there you're getting, you know, videography by a certified operator. It seems to me like a kind of ready opportunity for the city.
So I'm not speaking like for the city, but my initial reaction might be that the county would be, so the county does these air permit inspections, and they're already buying a FLIR camera. So I know that. So that might be a really good collaborative opportunity for how to share resources.
Good
and
information.
they're building up, like they're going to have, so here in Fort Collins, we have 2 active wells. They're going to have not the tens of thousands like Weld County, but they're in the hundreds in Larimer County and growing. So they're going to have an oil and gas program, and I think would be interested in that conversation about sharing resources. Hard cases to make for the city organization, I will say, is I think even working on the regulatory stuff is a hard conversation. We don't have dedicated oil and gas personnel. So I told you guys, I'm an air quality program manager. We have a planner, and we're taking the best that we can from all the conversations going on and updating our regulations. Mm-hmm. We're, I won't call it low risk, but we've just had a discussion that says that there's no interest in allowing any new oil and gas wells. We do have some legacy wells, and so what can we do with that? We have an operator agreement. It has some operating requirements. They are required to do FLIR camera monitoring. That's part of their leak detection and repair requirement. And the new state requirements, I mean, in my opinion, that watching this transition from old to new, they're pretty robust. They haven't been tested, but they had a lot of advocacy involved in that, and they were pretty responsive to what they were hearing. So that's part of the city conversation too, is how much do we as a city organization need to invest in programs related to our wells, and how much of that is the state role, so that we can leverage as much from the state and the county as we can.
Yeah, or the county's role, because the county, I think with the new commissioners, the county is going to take a lot more interest in trying to address public health, safety, and environment issues related to oil and gas. The previous county government wasn't interested in that at all, but the new county commissioners are quite different. And a collaborative, a close working relationship between the city and the county would be good. The city does actually have, it has scope for addressing these concerns beyond the specific exact boundaries on the map. At risk of increasing your workload, Cassie, under the new state rules for oil and gas, local governments have proximate responsibility and to some extent authority extending well beyond their specific exact boundaries, because things like air quality issues and health and safety issues and environment issues don't stop exactly at boundaries. So the city actually, under the state rules, has approximate responsibility for addressing issues in proximity to its boundaries, not strictly stopping at the boundary itself. It's not clear exactly what that proximity, how that will be defined in specific exact situations, but it means that some of those oil and well sites in Northeast Fort Collins, which are outside of the growth management area, still the city of Fort Collins has proximate responsibility to engage in addressing oil and gas issues related to those sites in consultation with the what's called the responsible government, which has direct responsibility. In that case, it's Larimer County.
Yep. Well, and an example, I'll say that, so that there's a role with COGCC, like a local government designee. So I serve in that role, and something we've been pretty successful with in the county, like, I don't know if you guys are tracking the new permit applications in Northeast Fort Collins. There are 3 pending though in the Fort Collins field. They're all outside of city limits. In collaboration with the county, once we were informed of those permits, like we pulled in a state consult and other consults, and the operator hasn't been able to address the issues that were raised in the state consult, and those won't move forward until they do. And by the time they do, all of these new regulations are in place. So they are collaborating with us on those already, and we're having conversations with their new updates and tracking that to see. Because another issue, like not just as a proximate local government, our natural areas ownership. If we think about an area like Soap Zone, like we certainly have an interest. We've heard from the community, like loud and clear, no desire for any surface use related to oil and gas on Soapstone property. So these things are coming through loud and clear. Now, how to pull those levers when we're not the regulatory government, but we are the surface owner, and we're not the proximate government in that case either, because it's far enough outside of city limits. But the county is having those conversations with us, knowing full well where our community wants us to be.
Yeah, Ed?
You had mentioned you were aware that the county had FLIR technology that they were using. Do you know what department that's operating under? Is that health department or?
Yeah, the, what do they call it? Larimer County Department of Public Health and Environment.
Okay. That's important to know. Thank you.
Well, okay. I think our questions are winding down. Cassie, thanks for joining our meeting. It's been really, really informative, and we look forward to working with your office in the future. And I'm sure everybody's going to benefit from greater communication between all parties involved.
Definitely. I mean, stay in touch. I'm really happy to share everything I know about things going on, if that's of use. So anytime, please stay in touch, and I can give you the download from my perspective.
You mentioned this Air Quality Advisory Board. Can people just show up at those meetings and listen?
Yeah, so those happen once a month. There's a public comment opportunity, much like a council session, at the beginning of the meeting. It's also a flexible board, so if you show up late and want to make comment, they'll probably allow it. But the formal public comment time is always available at the beginning of a meeting.
Well, great. Well, thanks again, and have a good rest of your day out there.
Yeah, you guys as well. Thanks for the invite. Good talking to you.
Thank you, Cassie.
Bye-bye.